will attract widespread support.
The Honourable Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Speaker, sorry. I guess that I was a little bit surprised to hear that the Minister was described as having brought this to the House with some alacrity, because I would have thought that any member of that government would have been embarrassed as to why we were bringing this matter before the House now. And I think it all goes back to a certain cup of tea when a certain Prime Minister sat down with a certain leader of a certain party in order to make certain that they were represented in Parliament after this general election, and that was one Mr John Banks. And the reason that Mr John Banks is so pertinent to this particular debate is because of a certain set of transactions that he remembers nothing about. And I'm absolutely gobsmacked that somebody with such an incredible, role of responsibility in this Parliament cannot remember receiving the kinds of donations that he received from one Mr Kim.com. But nobody remembers Mr Kim.com, and I don't know about anyone else in this House, but when I first heard his name, which was actually quite some time ago, I actually thought how prescient his parents were to have a surname like .com, not knowing that one day it would come to mean something quite different from what it meant in those days. But it certainly did strike me as a name that you wouldn't forget. And so if anyone ever heard the name .com, you'd remember the name .com, wouldn't you? I mean, it's just one of those particular names. But in actual fact, well, yes, it is. He's sort of the guy that you wouldn't forget meeting either, unless you were somebody that couldn't remember a significant donation from somebody like a certain person that you couldn't remember meeting, such as that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I think that the government is playing ducks and drakes on this particular piece of legislation. The reason that we didn't turn our attention to the financing rules under the local electoral legislation is that there wasn't a case that had been brought to anyone's attention in this Parliament until this very recent case in relation to Mr John Banks. And that's why it actually it behoves our House to actually address this issue and to bring the legislation in line with the electoral finance rules that apply in a general election. So I think we would be dealing with this in the same order of events had that occurred at an earlier stage. We still would have addressed this issue in line with the general election rules if in fact this had arisen at the time and of course it hadn't been brought to anyone's attention. We think that it's a good idea to change the law to bring the local electoral rules into line with the central government rules, but I don't think anyone in this House can pretend that any of this is particularly ideal, because of course we all know that there are people in this House who have approached people to ask for anonymous donations, and to have those anonymous donations immediately under the threshold, $1,500 for an individual, $15,000 for a party, $14,999 being written out as a cheque to the National Party as a donation, of course anonymously, not having to be disclosed, because that was the point at which the non-disclosure would have prevailed. So I believe that we have to face up to the fact that, in actual fact, that there are a number of instances where there are attempts to avoid the donation rules wherever they apply. But this particular one, I guess, does raise some serious concerns, and I am actually glad that it's coming to the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, because I think we need to face up to the reality that people in this situation have actually work to technically stay within the rules of the law, but when they've breached the spirit of transparency that New Zealanders expect around political donations, I think that people can feel justifiably let down. And I think people have been justifiably let down or felt disappointed in the way that the government has responded to this particular issue, because a lot of people felt that when John Key stood in front of the people of New Zealand in 2008 and said that he wanted to achieve things for this country, they believed in him, and I believe that a lot of people are disappointed in what he has failed to deliver. And the way that he stuck up for John Banks, I believe, adds to that sense of disappointment in a very, very particular way. People felt that there was no reason for the Prime Minister to stick up for Mr Banks when it became absolutely crystal clear that he had received donations in his role as a mayoral candidate, even though he wasn't a minister at the time, to accept that that person could remain a minister with that lack of integrity in the way that he dealt with donations at that time, I believe is absolutely relevant to whether he should be a minister today. And there isn't actually a person in New Zealand who disagrees with that, with perhaps the exception of Mr John Banks. I believe that most New Zealanders are absolutely committed to the idea that the integrity in that role traverses the experience of when he was standing for the mayoral candidacy and when he's standing for when he's in a ministerial position. And if the people of New Zealand cannot trust one of their own cabinet ministers or out of cabinet ministers to actually have that degree of integrity in his role as a mayoral candidate, then I believe that they are quite justifiably sceptical about the degree of trust that they can put in his role as a minister. And I think it is a shame that there is no there's been no acceptance on the other side of the House that this has come about because of the circumstances that were revealed in a way that wouldn't have come to the public attention if it hadn't been exposed in the way that it was. We put legislation into a private member's bill at the time that this became an issue so that we could align the Local Electoral Act with the Electoral Act, and it was raised as a particular point of view, I think, by one of my colleagues, Grant Robertson, who was commenting on the lack of consistency, saying quite clearly what we've seen in Mr Banks's case is while he might be able to claim that he hasn't technically broken the law, he's clearly breached the spirit of transparency that New Zealanders would expect around political campaigns. And so despite the fact that we had legislation in the name of one of our opposition members, the government really wasn't taking this seriously until they felt that they really couldn't back away from it any further. So there has been a degree of, and I'm not allowed to use a certain word to describe what it does look like, but it does seem... Can you say that? Can you have a hypocritical position? Okay, so I think that there have been hypocritical positions adopted in this particular matter, and that there are issues that I believe that the government has to front up to on this point. And I think that there has been too much memory loss over this particular matter. I mean, first of all, we had the memory loss relating to Mr Banks himself. He couldn't remember various things that had happened. And then there was the deliberate decision, I think, of the Prime Minister not to read certain information or not to have advice provided to him on certain information. So that's called willful blindness. So we've got memory loss and willful blindness. And I believe that that isn't good enough. I think that the people of New Zealand actually require of their politicians that we have a corruption-free environment, that we do not have the degree of undisclosed interests that dominate the environment in other countries, and we're observing an election in another country at the moment. And of course, you know, the amount of money that people see being collected and spent in that environment is something we would never want to see in this country. And part of what protects us from that is absolute upfront disclosure, and that's why we'll be supporting this bill.
I call Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to take a call on the Local Electoral Amendment Bill number 2, and I think the John Banks Bill would be a very good title for